It wasn't forged in a grand laboratory or in the halls of a general's headquarters. It began in a rented workshop in Butler, Pennsylvania, the summer of 1940, when the world was burning and America was still pretending it wasn't. The Army's request had sounded almost impossible. A light, four-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle under 300 pounds, capable of climbing anything, carrying everything, and surviving everywhere. In plain language, build a soldier's miracle on wheels. They gave the challenge to 135 companies, just 49 days to design and deliver a working prototype. Almost everyone refused. It was a suicide schedule, madness against blueprints, bureaucracy against time. But one company said yes. Not a Detroit giant, not a manufacturing empire, a small, almost anonymous outfit called American Bantam Car Company, known more for tiny British-style roadsters than for military machines. Their finances were a thread, their workforce barely 200 men. Yet their chief engineer, a wiry visionary named Karl Probst, looked at the Army specs and didn't see failure. He saw a challenge that smelled like history. On July 17, 1940, Bantam's telegram arrived at the Army quartermaster's office. "We'll build it." No press release, no fanfare, just a promise written on company letterhead, a $1 prototype bid. They would build the vehicle for a single dollar if the government supplied materials. At that moment, a bet of a lifetime began. Probst worked in an office without air conditioning, chain smoking and sketching over butcher paper. He drew from instinct: rectangle frame, short wheelbase, flat fenders for visibility, fold-down windshield to reduce glare, a tractor's heart inside a car's body. He borrowed axles from trucks, steering from sedans, and an engine from Continental. Every component carried the scent of improvisation. The Army didn't want design beauty, it wanted utility. Soldiers needed something simple enough to repair in mud, cheap enough to replace in numbers, rugged enough to outlive its driver. By day, Bantam's small factory hammered prototypes out of recycled bolts and borrowed tools. By night, Probst and his foreman, Jack Dowling, tested suspension springs on unpaved slopes outside Butler, headlights cutting through the dark, engineers clinging to fenders like prospectors chasing gold. Fuel ran low, funds vanished. But inspiration, that strange chemical that makes small men build great things, never did. Probst kept a calendar on the wall, marking days not with pen but with grease fingerprints. 49. The number glowed brighter with each dawn. As August bled into September, the prototype skeleton began to breathe. A small rectangle grille of 9 slots framed the front, a vertical snout flanked by simple round lamps. Function had found its shape. The Army watched skeptically from afar. Their officers sent telegrams weekly asking for progress photos that didn't exist. Bantam didn't have a photographer. They had welders, machinists, and faith. On September 21, 1940, 49 days after the contract was signed, the impossible machine rolled onto Butler's main street under its own power. The locals stepped out of barbershops and cafes, watching a stub-nosed, square-shouldered contraption rattle past. No chrome, no ornament, just purpose. Someone joked that it looked like a half-ton bulldog. Someone else muttered, "That ugly little thing will save lives." They were both right. The prototype was driven 500 miles east to the Army Test Center at Camp Holabird, Maryland, overnight by engineers taking turns at the wheel through rain and exhaustion. The vehicle had no official name yet, just a serial number, Bantam Number 1. When it arrived at daybreak, it was streaked in mud, taillights flickering dimly, but still running. Army officers, skeptical and stiff, circled it like judges at a prize fight. They tested the doors, none. They kicked the tires, too small but holding. They checked the weight, exactly 173 pounds. Then they told Probst, "Let's see if it can climb." And climb it did. At Hollabird's obstacle course, Bantam Number 1 roared up ramps, bounced over logs, and forded 2 feet of water where jeeps that didn't yet exist would someday follow. When the test ended, the colonel in charge shook his head and said, "Gentlemen, we may be looking at the future of American mobility." But success in war is never solitary. Triumph attracts challengers, and politics moves faster than wheels. Even as Bantam's blueprints passed inspection, the Army quietly began sending copies to 2 bigger companies, Willys Overland in Toledo and the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn. Bantam had built the miracle. Others would now be invited to scale it. At their modest factory, Probst and his team celebrated with black coffee and exhaustion. They didn't yet realize their creation was already leaving their hands, destined to grow beyond them, reborn under new badges. Bantam's miracle rolled into history on a wet Maryland morning, but its fate was decided in boardrooms and barracks. The Army loved the prototype's spirit, but the war to come demanded hundreds of thousands, not hundreds. Bantam's tiny factory, less than a city block wide, could never keep up with the scale of coming conflict. Detroit smelled opportunity. Willys Overland, hungry to rebuild after Depression woes, received the Army's request for quick improvements. Ford, the manufacturing giant with assembly lines echoing into the horizon, entered the fray. The Army handed out Bantam's blueprints to both, weighing who could build faster, stronger, and at scale. Willys' chief engineer, Delmar Barney Roos, stared at Bantam's creations and saw potential, if the engine was more robust. Working night after night, he dropped in the now legendary Go Devil 2.2-liter 4. It gave the Willys prototype a throaty growl and enough torque to muscle through mud or carry a wounded man out of a shell hole. Ford, meanwhile, brought its production mastery. Their model, GP, for government 80-inch wheelbase, was precise and efficient, stamped out by the thousands with signature Dearborn speed. Testing became a spectacle. Army brass watched as Bantam, Willys, and Ford each raced their new vehicles. Jeeps that had no real name yet, over hills, through pits of clay, fording icy streams, stalling, restarting, braking, repairing. Soldiers loved Willys' power. Commanders admired Ford's reliability. All quietly respected the original Bantam for its agility and soul. Yet in wartime, sentiment means little against logistics. The Army chose Willys' design as the standard, Bantam's shape, Willys' engine. Then, as Ford's plants roared into action, the Army issued them Willys' blueprints too. The result would be chaotic genius. 3 companies, 1 basic design, tens of thousands of men working around the clock. The vehicle's informal name bubbled up through the ranks. Soldiers, irreverent and ungovernable, dubbed it a Jeep. Some claimed it came from slurred GP, for general purpose. Others insisted it was borrowed from a cartoon character, Eugene the Jeep, a magical, clever creature that could go anywhere in the Popeye comic strips. The name stuck, better than anything made official. By early 1941, the snowball was gathering mass. Willys and Ford churned out prototypes, each marked sample in block letters on the fenders. Engineers huddled in cold warehouses, swapping ideas like poker chips, drop axles for easier repair, waterproof ignitions to cross rivers, blackout lights for night maneuvers. Word of the Jeep spread overseas faster than the vehicles themselves. British officers visiting U.S. camps saw Bantams and Willys scaling hills and wanted them for North Africa's deserts. A British liaison wrote, "If we had ships enough to bring them, we'd take every one you can build." Willys engineers, proud and relentless, etched Willys in bold block letters across their hoods. Ford, in turn, stamped Ford deep into the steel, as if branding cattle. The only constant, however, was the vehicle's shape, those flat fenders and fighting stance, the square-cut grille that made even officers grin with recognition. The blueprint had so much utility that it resisted every attempt at overdesign. Meanwhile, Bantam, the company that started it all, faced bitter irony. Army orders dried up, too small, too slow, the blueprints they'd invented now building someone else's empire. But Probst didn't fight City Hall. He understood something lasting, that in war, an idea is often bigger than the hands that birth it. The Jeep's days as prototype were numbered. Released for mass production, the Willys MB and later the Ford Jeep W began to roll out by the hundreds each week, then by the thousands. Orders shot upward, to Africa, to Normandy, to Burma, across every front. But for most mechanics and GIs, the Jeep was still not a Willys or a Ford, nor even just a truck. It was the Jeep, the tool that could do everything, the friend beneath every squad leader, the chariot entering hell 100 yards faster than a tank could follow. With the cranking of every new Jeep, the story of how it was born, a $1 bid, 49 sleepless days, 2 working men burning candles in Butler, became legend only whispered, always overshadowed by the thunder of what came next. By late 1942, the world at war had discovered its unexpected champion, a box of steel and grit with no doors, no chrome, and no fear. The Jeep was everywhere, from the baked sand of El Alamein to the jungles of the Pacific. From Soviet steppes to Sicilian mountains, it carried more than soldiers. It carried belief, the belief that ingenuity could outrun destruction. In the deserts of North Africa, the rumor reached Rommel's Africa Corps before their scouts even confirmed it. A small Allied car could outmaneuver panzers between dunes, leap craters, and climb walls of sand that would humble a tank. Mechanics marveled at its temperament, an engine that would start after drowning in a river, axles that bent but never broke, and a gearbox simple enough to be fixed with a mess kit spoon. Drivers strapped jerry cans to its sides, bolted rifles to its hood, and renamed it with reverence, the Blitz buggy. The Jeep could do everything except give up. In Tunisia, General Eisenhower watched one climb a rubble slope near his command post and simply declared, "The Jeep is America's greatest contribution to modern warfare." He wasn't exaggerating. The machine blurred distinctions between officers and men. Generals rode in them to the front line. Privates used them as ambulances, mobile kitchens, even chapels. Its folding windshield reflected nothing but dust. Its seats wore scars from 1,000 journeys. Every scratch meant someone made it back. In every theater, soldiers discovered new tricks. Jeeps plowed through rice paddies in Burma, churned through ankle-deep mud in Guadalcanal, splashed through alpine rivers in Italy. They towed anti-tank guns, pulled mobile radar arrays, and carried more ammunition than they were ever designed to bear. Pilots used them as tow vehicles on airstrips hacked from coral. Engineers mounted recoilless rifles to their beds and turned them into strike vehicles. Their silhouettes dotted every landscape like punctuation marks in a relentless sentence of advance. It was practicality made beautiful, the poetry of utility written in grease and gears. Meanwhile, in Detroit, the factories became temples of repetition. The stamping hammers never slept. Each day produced thousands of near-identical bodies, the lines moving with hypnotic rhythm. Ford built its GPW under license, parts interchangeable with Willys' MB to the last bolt. Wooden crates rolled out labeled to be assembled in theater. And all the while, Bantam and Butler built trailers, their consolation prize, tiny, rugged boxes chained to the back of the sons they had conceived. Probst followed production numbers in the newspapers with mixed pride. His design now wore different names, but its DNA stayed pure. He used to say, "If men remember the machine and not the maker, that's fine, provided they remember the result." As victory tides shifted, the Jeep became theater legend. A crew could fix it anywhere. Somewhere in Sicily, Corporal Tom Haywood replaced a piston ring with a scrap of a Coca-Cola can. In New Guinea, engineers built pontoons under 2 Jeeps and turned them into makeshift ferries. In France, soldiers strung communication wire from miles of countryside using nothing but Jeeps dragging spools. The war adapted around it. The speed of advance was measured in Jeep miles now, not infantry steps. By 1944, production had crossed 640,000 units, a figure unimaginable just 3 years earlier. Each cost just $738, cheap enough to abandon if damaged, simple enough to repair with pliers. Hollywood cameramen embedded with combat units loved them. Their small frames could mount film cameras to capture charging columns. War correspondent Ernie Pyle called it a faithful dog of war. But beneath triumph lay exhaustion. Men and machines had limits. Mud hardened into armor plate on tires. Engines finally cracked after 1,000-mile slogging. Soldiers slept sitting upright in them, steering wheels pressed against their chests. The smell of gasoline and cordite fused into nostrils forever. The Jeep might have been indestructible, but its passengers were not. In Normandy, the Jeep met its most brutal trial, hedgerows welded from centuries of soil and roots. Tanks bogged down instantly, yet Jeeps learned to fly, bounding from embankments at full throttle. Colonel Raff of the 82nd Airborne strapped pipe cutters to the front bumper, slicing through hedges like scissors. When supply routes to the beaches clogged, Jeeps darted forward along mule trails, bridging logistics gaps that textbooks hadn't anticipated. The soldiers' war machine had outgrown orders. Then came the winter of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Snow-muffled artillery, engines choked in white silence. Still, the Jeep refused surrender. Photographs show them half-buried in snowdrifts, tarps slung like makeshift tents, headlights painted black to hide from night bombers. Drivers wrapped the gear levers in wool, coaxed the Go Devil engines with torch-heated oil to life again. All across the Ardennes, they carried medics through fog and wounded men back to warmth. The windshield might be frosted like glass relics, but the Jeep's engine note became a promise. They're coming back. When the Allied line finally pushed east, so did the fleet of conquerors. Across Rhine bridges and into ruined German towns rolled an endless gray-green tide of Jeeps, splattered with chalk, each bearing names stenciled on its hood. Lil Abner, faithful, Kansas kid. To the liberated, they looked like messengers from another world, fast, loud, unbreakable. Children rode on fenders smiling for the first time in years. Somewhere amid all this chaos, an unsentimental truth solidified. The Jeep wasn't merely a vehicle anymore. It was a symbol of mobility as freedom. To the Allies, it proved that power could come from practicality, not size. To every soldier, it represented independence, the ability to go anywhere under his own control. When the German surrender finally came in May 1945, more than 500,000 Jeeps covered Europe's landscape, parked beside barns, hidden in forests, idling on airfields. Mechanics called them the only weapon that doesn't aim but wins anyway. Generals joked that they should have engraved the words "made in 49 days" on every dashboard. But in every victory photograph, from Paris to Berlin to the ruins of Manila, somewhere behind the flags and helmets, there was always that unmistakable shape, small, square, clean. Its splayed tires and folded windshield framed history without ever demanding the spotlight. When peace finally came, the world was scattered with Jeeps like steel seeds in new soil. 500,000 of them waited in fields, ports, and motor pools. Their paint was blistered from the sun, tires worn slick, seats patched with canvas from old tents. Yet every one of them still started when asked. The war had ended, but the sound of a Jeep engine, that low, confident rumble, still echoed through the ruins like the heartbeat of victory. In Europe, displaced civilians used them to carry bricks, tow wagons, deliver bread. Farmers plowed with them. Doctors turned them into makeshift ambulances that ran from village to village. On the islands of the Pacific, they became mail carriers, school buses, water pumps. The machine built for war had become the most democratic vehicle ever made. It obeyed whoever turned the key, regardless of uniform. In America, something even stranger happened. Soldiers returning home remembered the little car that had carried them everywhere, across rivers and battlefields, and they wanted that feeling again, the power to go anywhere, conquer anything. Willie's Overland, quick to sense the mood, cleaned up the design, painted it civilian colors, and renamed it the CJ2A, Civilian Jeep. For once, a warhorse came home not as a relic, but as the beginning of a new idea. Advertisements called it the sun and shadow car and the power farmer's friend. But the truth didn't need print. Farmers in Iowa saw the CJ pull a two-blade plow where tractors couldn't fit. Ranchers in Colorado watched it climb slopes like a mule. Suburban families took them into forests, painting patriotic memories into weekend freedom. America and the world were learning that the same machine that conquered war could also conquer distance. Other nations followed. In France, surviving Jeeps became the basis of local automakers' rebirth. In the Soviet Union, engineers studied captured ones like textbooks on mobility. In Japan, the rising automotive industry used them as templates for reliability. The Jeep had become the world's post-war language of motion. Back in Butler, Pennsylvania, the birthplace that history almost forgot, a handful of Bantam workers gathered outside the now quiet factory. Windows boarded, machines silent, but their creation lived on across continents. Karl Probst, now gray and thin, received visit after visit from journalists who wanted an interview. He always gave the same answer. It wasn't one man. It was an idea that refused to be late. He never grew bitter. When asked how it felt to watch others reap fame from his invention, he smiled faintly. When a soldier drives home safe because that motor didn't quit, what else should I want? Across the Atlantic, on ravaged roads where tanks once rolled, a different kind of army marched, the army of the ordinary. Mechanics rehung signboards on garages, young men repaired bridges, film crews documented peace. And in almost every shot stood a Jeep, sometimes battered, sometimes painted anew, headlights shining through fog. It had become more than hardware. It was history on wheels, a testament that practicality could be sacred. The world turned, and decades passed. The Korean War, the Cold War, the long tale of global tension. Yet wherever Americans moved, their little 4x4 followed. Its descendants carried astronauts across Cape Canaveral dunes, explorers into the Himalayas, and journalists through the Congo. The Jeep's design evolved, wider, stronger, cleaner, but the soul stayed identical. 4 wheels, open sky, and a promise that nothing impassable would stay that way for long. For every Jeep parading in peacetime, there existed a ghost in camouflage behind it, the prototype that was born in 49 days for a single dollar. That number lived as myth, passed between engineers who whispered it like a prayer. $1, the cost of an idea that had rewritten how machines could serve men. At reunions decades later, veterans told stories not of medals or ranks, but of their Jeeps. How one floated across a river lashed to oil drums, how another survived an artillery blast and still limped home, or how an exhausted driver fell asleep and awoke still moving, because his sergeant kept the clutch pressed with his boot. Each story ended the same way: laughter, a hand resting on invisible steel, and silence, thick with memory. Modern manufacturers would sculpt the Jeep into a brand, a lifestyle, a market. But somewhere beneath every showroom polish, if you listened hard enough, the old heartbeats remained. The thrum of an engine built by people who had no time, no budget, and no margin for failure. A machine built not for profit, but for necessity, whose worth was measured not in currency, but in lives returned. The Jeep stands today as one of humanity's simplest paradoxes, a weapon that outlived its war by teaching peace to travel farther. Its squared bonnet mirrors the logic that won the 20th century, that the right tool, honest and unpretentious, can remake civilization. If you visit the Butler Museum on a quiet afternoon, you'll find the Bantam No. 1 pilot car, restored and gleaming under soft light. Its paint still bears sand from early test trials. Its frame carries scars from a war it never fought, but made possible to win. Walk close, and you can almost see 3 men bent over their drafting table in 1940, sleeves rolled up, cigarettes burning low, betting the future on stubborn faith. 49 days, $1, one legacy that never stopped moving. The story of the Jeep isn't about wheels or horsepower. It's about the power of constraint, the fire that scarcity ignites in human imagination. Out of urgency came elegance, out of failure came freedom. More than 80 years later, that same silhouette crosses highways and deserts unchanged, square, steadfast, unstoppable. Proof that sometimes the smallest machines carry the biggest truths. The $1 prototype never died. It simply kept going. The silence that followed was not peace, only the sound of history turning its page.